Davey Shlasko, welcome to the back cover. How are you today?
Doing well. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Now, you, of course, are the CEO and founder of Think Again Training and Consulting. You've got over 20 years of experience. Just in your words, can you tell those for maybe who haven't heard of you what exactly it is that you do?
Sure. So we consult with organizations that want to do better around issues of equity and inclusion of all kinds, thinking about race and culture and gender and disability. Um, and one of the aspects of that we do, I would say more than most consultants in the field, is thinking about the inclusion of transgender employees, as well as trans clients and students and patients, depending on the kind of organization.
Amazing. Look, me personally, I'm very passionate about workplace bullying and toxic leadership. This is something that most people have endured. So I wanted to get your thoughts on this in particular. So workplace bullying and toxic leadership are significant issues that can disproportionately affect all employees, particularly trans people. How do you advise companies to combat these challenges, especially when the bullying or toxicity is coming from higher levels of management?
Yeah, it is hardest when it's coming from higher levels of management for sure. I think one thing that any organization can do is set clear expectations for respectful behavior. And sometimes that means helping people distinguish between their personal beliefs or sometimes religious beliefs and what's appropriate in the workplace and what's relevant in the workplace.
Yeah.
Um, Ideally, those clear expectations come from leadership, but when they don't, then sometimes it's somebody else, maybe in HR, or maybe a trans person who's having to sort of recruit allies to help them bring the message that this isn't a sort of special, it's not a special consideration, it is just part of being welcoming to everybody. And that needs to include trans people.
Yeah, well said. So, with over 2 decades of experience, what significant changes have you seen in workplace attitudes toward trans inclusivity, and what challenges remain the most persistent?
Hmm. There's so much has changed and yet so little. Um, and I'm based in the United States, of course, and in some ways, there's much more awareness of trans people. When I started doing this work, doing a professional development training, we had to start with just what even does trans mean. People didn't know, didn't have a shared understanding of that. And now they do, and a lot more people are understanding and supportive, but we also have a lot more backlash. And so people feel entitled in some cases to be really cruel because they see political leaders modeling that. So for some specific changes, it used to be almost unanimous that organizational leaders would think of trans inclusion as something really extra, as a sort of special need, that they were doing you a huge favor if they accommodated you. And often would say it's too much to expect for colleagues to call you the right name and pronouns or just really basic things like that. And so the very best that we could expect as trans employees or job seekers was to find someplace that was not hostile, but would still usually be really ill-informed and not prepared to actually treat trans people as well as other employees. Now, many more places have laws that protect trans people. In the United States, that's wildly uneven because of the bizarre system we have. In some states, the protection is great, and in some it isn't. Technically, there's some federal protection, but all of that really depends on the election, so
Yeah.
who knows?
Well,
And in any case, non-discrimination laws are often really ineffective. The best that they do is they give you recourse when someone discriminates, but they don't prevent discrimination in effective ways. I think the largest change actually is among trans people more than a change in employers, where many more young people have had experiences of inclusion and experiences of being supported so that they're able to come out much earlier and live as the gender they are much earlier. So they may arrive to the workplace with higher expectations, which then pushes employers to actually implement the inclusive practices that might have been hypothetical or considered really going above and beyond before.
Yeah, definitely. And you did mention that we are sort of hearing more about, trans people nowadays.
Mhm.
Is that because people are sort of feeling more comfortable to be themselves?
I think so. And I think it's um, people are more comfortable to be themselves because they have the language for it and because they have heard of trans people existing, right? I don't know whether I would have identified as trans earlier if I had the words, but what I know is I didn't know that trans men existed or trans masculine people at all until I went to college. Before that, I had heard of transsexual women, I guess, and that's it. And like not in positive ways either. We just didn't have a shared public understanding of different kinds of trans identities really at all. Um, so very often when I'm doing a professional development training, one of the questions is why are there so many more trans people these days, and especially more trans kids? And I always refer people to that graph that circulates on the social media of how many left-handed people there were. And then when that graph just shoots up so drastically and then plateaus, it's not that more people suddenly became left-handed, right? Because schools stopped punishing people for being left-handed.
Yes.
So really similarly, for many kids, if everyone in their life is saying you're a boy and the kid is saying I'm not a boy, I'm a girl, the kid will just get punished and then they may never be able to live as themselves, or they may not come out or transition until well into adulthood, right? But
Yeah.
if a kid says, oh, the gender you're saying I am is not right for me, and adults around them say, huh, tell me more, what do you need from me? Then that kid can be much more self-possessed, much more confident, can uh, grow into one of those adults who enters their first job and says, so everyone's going to call me the right name and pronoun.
Yeah. Yeah. And you did mention that you, of course, are trans. And then you also said that you didn't always, understand what trans meant. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious as to at what point in your life did you, realize your identity?
Mm. When I was in college, I met some other young people who were trans and, in particular, identifying as genderqueer, which is more often now we hear the word non binary. Non binary
Yes.
is a more recent word. They mean basically the same thing, which is to say they mean different things to different people, but both of them broadly can mean almost anything besides simply a man or simply a woman. Um, and so I didn't, in high school, I didn't have a strong feeling of like, I'm not a woman or whatever, but I also didn't have a strong feeling if I am a woman. And so when I heard that there were other possibilities, I was like, huh, I wonder, I wonder how that might feel. And was just really fortunate to be in a very supportive community where people were not stressed out about it and were not stressed out about sort of trying to pin down, well, what exactly are you? And I got to basically experiment socially. And my friends would say, oh, do you want us to call you this other name for a week or so and see how it feels? Do you want us to call you these pronouns and see how it feels?
Yeah.
Um, and I got to learn about myself um, by experiencing myself socially in different ways of doing gender, right?
Yeah. And what was that like for you to be able to finally sort of, understand who you were?
Hmm. I think in some ways it's really freeing. I did not have to do as much work to try to be acceptable as a woman. I was always pretty inept at femininity. I don't think that's not necessarily every trans person's experience, right? But I put a lot of work into being an acceptable enough girl in school. And then I didn't have to do that much work anymore and got to think about other things.
Mhm.
Um, in other ways, it was really challenging because as a young person, I did feel kind of entitled to be treated the way I was asking to be treated and to be treated with respect. And that really limited my job prospects. When I finished when I finished college, it was not illegal to discriminate against trans people.
Mhm.
And so I had a few job interviews in which somebody basically said, we think you'd be great at this job, but we just don't want a trans person working here.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just wanted to ask you about pronouns because I know you did briefly touch on this, but why is it so important to get it right and to, I guess, use the correct pronouns? Because you often hear, conservative commentators saying, well, I'm not participating in that sort of delusion, quote unquote, or, basically refusing to, use the right pronouns. And when you consider things like, mental health, suicide rates amongst trans people, why is it so important to use the correct pronouns?
Absolutely. I mean, we have a body of research, particularly about trans youth, showing that being called the name and the pronouns that you want to be called leads to better mental health outcomes. And for young people in particular, better mental health leads to better academic performance, better job prospects, better life stability in general. I, that's the answer for when someone really needs to be convinced by data. I think there's a simpler answer that's just like, it doesn't harm anyone to just treat people the way they want to be treated. It's not hard. And why wouldn't we? If somebody's legal name is Jeffrey and he goes by Jeff, you call him Jeff. You don't hassle him by insisting on Jeffrey, right? And if someone's legal name is Jeffrey and she goes by Diane, then you call her Diane. It's not that hard. Mm-hmm. I think I'm often torn about pronouns in organizations because that's the first thing that people want training on and want to be able to get right. And it is really important, as you pointed out. It's also not the only important thing. And I worry that sometimes organizations feel like, well, we have a pronouns policy, so we're done, right? And that's really only at the beginning. I guess one other thing I'll say about pronouns is it's also just about boundaries and consent. So
Right.
if I say, please call me this and not this, and then you don't do that, then it's not just that I don't trust you about my gender, I don't trust you to respect my boundaries at all.
Yeah.
So that's a really fast way to make a workplace feel really unsafe for someone.
Yeah, definitely. Many organizations include DEI initiatives but fail to adequately address trans inclusivity. Why do you think trans-specific issues are often sidelined, and what are the risks of continuing to do so?
Yeah, so one reason is that there's an assumption that it's a very small population, which is quite difficult to measure, but certainly not as small as people think it is. Some people, of course, have religious objections or just discomfort in general, and feel entitled to their comfort, even at the expense of someone else's safety. There's also often an assumption that, like I said with pronouns, we have a pronoun policy, so we're done, right? If we've just gotten so far as being not hostile, then we're inclusive enough. And that's an error that people make about lots of kinds of inclusion. Finally, I think there's some degree of it that's actually not about hostility, that in many workplaces, the reason that trans exclusion is happening is not because anyone is trying to be hostile, but because we've all been taught to do our jobs as if trans people don't exist. Mm-hmm. That's how we've all been trained, right? If you took an intro psychology course, it was about men and women. If you took any training, right, that's how the organization is structured. That's how we've all been taught. And so there actually is a kind of challenging rethinking that has to happen, of really understanding, what would my job mean? What would it look like? How would I act? What would my procedures be if I assumed that any kind of trans person might be in any role, might be my colleague, might be my boss, might be my client? If we designed everything on that basis, things would be really different. And that is a big piece of work. So that can be part of the resistance to including it.
Yeah.
And you asked about the risks.
Yeah.
So one is, a growing trans population means you'll get a bad reputation. And it is in some ways a small community, and trans people talk to each other. So that's a real risk. Depending on your location, there can be legal ramifications where harassing somebody or just failing to respect them based on gender is illegal, and the organization can get in trouble about that. I think the piece that many organizations might not realize is that being exclusionary towards trans people, it's bad for morale and retention of trans people, but it's also bad for morale and retention of anybody. Because if you see your colleague being treated poorly, that doesn't make you trust that it's a workplace that can treat you well, right? Even if you're not being directly targeted yet.
That's so true. Yeah. So when you conduct training or consultations, what are some of the biggest misconceptions or barriers you encounter from management teams about trans inclusivity?
I think one misconception is that, well, that trans people are really unusual. That's one. Another is that it's really hard to be trans inclusive, and I don't think it actually is in the end. There's some hard thinking that goes into it, but it's not. It is sort of revolutionary, and also it isn't. It's also a lot about just treating people as who they are, and addressing the real needs of the real people.
Yeah.
I think there's sometimes a misconception about how much pushback they'll get. Often there is pushback, but very often it's less than people might be concerned about. Often supporters will just come out of the woodwork.
Yeah.
Finally, I think there is sometimes a misconception that not only that there are few trans people overall, but it's mostly young people. They don't think they'll ever meet a trans person over 40. And also it's mostly white people and mostly highly educated people. And they don't realize that there are trans people in every community and always have been.
Yeah.
So sometimes I work mostly with small to medium-sized organizations. And sometimes they think, oh, we're totally trans friendly because we had a trans person who worked here once.
Yes.
And maybe that was like the least challenging trans person to their misconceptions, right? So maybe they're not yet prepared to work with other kinds of trans people well.
Yeah. Yes. As someone who is both a consultant and a trans person, how do you navigate the personal and professional dynamics in your work, especially when dealing with companies that may be resistant to change?
Mm-hmm. This is such a good question, and I've really grappled with it within my own consulting practice. Many of the consultants I work with are trans and are tired of doing this work. One piece is we often focus on training and supporting the people who do want to make the change and equipping them with the tools they need to advocate. We're not necessarily wasting time trying to convince people to want to be trans friendly if they don't want to, but we can help the people who are ready to make those changes put systems and structures in place to make that easier.
Yeah.
We also recently developed a self-paced online training, and my academic background is in teaching. So for a long time, I was just very against that and thought like, you can't possibly train people really well and in a really participatory way if you're not face-to-face. Of course, COVID changed a lot of that and we learned how to be face-to-face in new ways. But also there's new and different technology. And so now very often what we're doing is having people first do this self-paced module that can take half an hour or an hour, depending on what pieces we use for the particular organization. And then we'll come in and be face-to-face and do some questions and answers, some discussion, some practice. But we're not having to do the labor of just repeating the same very basic information for the 100th or 1000th time.
Yeah. And Davey, lastly, what is your advice to someone, who may be at home listening, who might feel different, but may not necessarily fully identify as trans or doesn't know whether they're trans? Where do you start?
Yeah, what a great question. I think the first thing is you don't have to know. It's okay. There's no deadline, right? It is okay to just feel what you feel and experience yourself the way you do and not have a word for it. And that's real. That's just as real as if you know for sure and have a good word for it. And there are now so many resources online, trans youth organizations in particular, making videos of young people explaining themselves. There are memoirs and anthologies and peer support groups, or even just community events. I think actually meeting trans people is a great way to just be in community. And if you see someone and you're like, oh, the way that person does their gender feels like me, cool. And if you see someone and you're like, that's not quite how I feel, that's great too. That's also information. And you make new friends.
Yeah, so true. And I will include links to trans organizations both here and in the United States as well for reference. Thank you so much, Davey. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. I appreciate your time.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me on.
All right. Have a great day.
You too. Take care.